The wind ripping off the Pacific didn't just bite. It chewed straight through bone. It was November at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, but for the men of Class 291, the location had stopped mattering days ago. We were deep in a new, deeply controversial evolution, a joint special operations assessment everyone was quietly calling Hell Week 2.0. This wasn't the standard crucible. This was 120 unbroken hours designed to find the absolute breaking point of a new program, fully integrating multi-purpose K-9S into the most brutal phases of maritime and land warfare. My name is Ryan Cole, Petty Officer 2nd Class. I was standing waist-deep in 54-degree water, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd crack. Tethered to my amphibious harness was Bandit, 70 pounds of Belgian Malinois the color of burnt timber, with eyes that held a terrifying, unblinking intelligence. While the rest of us shivered, hallucinated, and wept quietly in the dark, Bandit stood perfectly still, freezing waves crashing against his chest, his gaze locked entirely on me. 100 yards away, dry behind the wind-shielded observation deck, stood General Mark Hollister. Hollister was a combat-hardened SOCOM commander who'd cut his teeth in the mountains of Afghanistan. An old-school pragmatist who believed adding an animal to a volatile, sleep-deprived survival scenario was a catastrophic liability. At the pre-evolution briefing, he'd made it brutally clear, jabbing a thick finger at my personnel file. You put a dog in the middle of a sleep-deprived, freezing squad, you don't get an asset. You get a liability. When a human body shuts down, when a mind fractures from cold and exhaustion, a man can barely save himself. Cole is going to break. And when he breaks, that dog is going to panic, go feral, or become deadweight. I give them 48 hours before they ring the bell. Now we were 72 hours in, and the general stood on that deck with a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the thermal monitors, waiting for the inevitable. The whistle blew. Hit the berm. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Reyes roared over the surf. I dragged my leaden legs out of the water, every muscle fiber screaming, wet sand grinding my inner thighs and armpits raw and bloody. I unclipped Bandit's lead and transitioned to a close-quarters tactical hold. He moved flawlessly, a shadow at my knee, completely unfazed by 20 exhausted men clawing up a collapsing dune. The psychological torture was worse than the physical. Reyes walked among us at the top of the berm, holding a warm, dry blanket and a thermos of chicken broth. "It's over whenever you want it to be, Cole," he whispered, stepping close. "The general's right up there. He knows you're done." The dog's shivering. "You're doing him a disservice. Ring the bell, take the blanket, and you both go to sleep." I looked at Bandit. He wasn't shivering. He bumped his wet snout against my bruised palm, a trained check-in that grounded me. "Negative, Chief," I rasped, spitting salt water. "We're just getting warmed up." They pushed us relentlessly. From surf torture to log PT. 6 men and 1 dog assigned to a waterlogged telephone pole near 400 pounds, the bark tearing the skin off our shoulders. I took the brunt of the weight, while Bandit was commanded into a strict downstay in the freezing mud directly beneath the log. If we dropped it, he'd be crushed. My vision tunneled, the edges going black. The kid behind me, a farm boy from Nebraska named Tucker, groaned as his knees buckled and the log dipped inches from Bandit's skull. "Hold it!" I screamed, my vocal cords tearing, and shoved upward with adrenaline I didn't know I had. Bandit didn't flinch. He just stared up at that timber, completely trusting me to hold the sky from falling. Up in the tower, Hollister narrowed his eyes at my heart rate redlining at 185. "He's burning out his reserves," he muttered. "Move them to the island. Let's see how they do in the rocks when the sun goes down." By hour 90, the assessment shifted from the flat beaches of Coronado to the razor-sharp terrain of the island, a desolate rock in the Pacific used for live fire and advanced navigation. The weather turned violent. A storm rolled in, dumping blinding rain that turned the steep ravines into muddy death traps. Our task was a night evasion exercise. Navigate 8 miles of brutal topography in total darkness, no white light, while being hunted by a fresh, well-fed opposing force using night vision and thermal optics. My body was shutting down. 4 days without sleep, and the brain starts throwing micro-sleeps and vivid hallucinations at you. Scrub Oak looked like crouching men. The rocks seemed to breathe. Only Bandit kept me tethered to reality. Twice he gave a silent, rigid point, alerting me to ambush patrols ahead so we could slip around them. But the elements didn't care about any of that. At 0200, the rain was a deafening roar. Leading the column, I stepped onto what looked like solid granite. It wasn't. It was a false ledge, undercut by the flash flood pouring down the mountain. The second I shifted my weight, the ground simply vanished. No time to scream. I plummeted into the dark, crashing through manzanita branches that whipped my face, hit a jagged outcropping, tumbled, and free fell another 15 feet into the rocky bottom of the ravine. The sound of my right leg snapping was louder than the thunder. Above me, the squad dropped into a perimeter. Man down. Cole is down. Tucker yelled into the wind. But the mudslide had taken a huge chunk of the trail. The edge was crumbling beneath his boots. Down in the blackness, I gasped, lungs paralyzed by the impact, the pain in my leg a white-hot flare. I reached down with trembling hands, soaked, but it wasn't just rain. It was warm, thick, sticky. A compound fracture. The jagged end of my tibia had punched clean through the skin. The artery was intact, but I was bleeding fast. Then a massive shape slid down the near-vertical mud wall, impossibly controlled. Bandit. He'd broken formation and navigated the drop, refusing to leave me. He pressed against my chest and licked the blood from my face to keep me conscious. I grabbed my radio, but the casing was shattered, the antenna snapped off on the rocks. Dead. Tucker's voice came faint over the storm. Cole, the trail's gone. We have to route 2 miles back to find a way down. Hold on. Then opt for flares lit the sky. The exercise was still live, and the instructors had no idea this was a real emergency. The squad had to scatter or fail the whole evolution. And just like that, I was alone at the bottom of a flooding ravine, bleeding out in the freezing rain. Back at the operations center, the general was staring at the digital map. Each of us wore a GPS tracker. My blue, that had separated from the group, plummeted in elevation and stopped cold. What happened to Cole? Hollister demanded. Lost his comms feed, sir. Telemetry shows a massive heart rate spike, then a rapid drop. He's stationary, deep in the trench. The squad had to break contact. The storm's grounding the medevac birds. We can't get a chopper in with these winds. He stared at the dot. I said the handler would break. He's either quit and is hiding from the storm, or he's incapacitated. In these temperatures, hypothermia will kill him before sunrise. He gave the order to send a ground response team, 4 hours on foot in that mud, and told them to assume a body recovery. And watch the dog. If Cole's unconscious, that animal reverts to instinct. It'll defend the body against the medics. It's exactly the liability I warned about. Down in the ravine, I was fading, shock setting in with violent shivering, my core temperature plummeting. With numb, clumsy fingers, I pulled a tourniquet, looped it above the shattered bone, and twisted the windlass, screaming into the dark as it clamped down. I marked the time strap, 0215. Maybe 2 hours before the tissue damage was permanent, less than that before hypothermia stopped my heart. But Bandit wasn't panicking. He wasn't feral. The training the general had so easily dismissed was kicking in. Bandit understood trauma. He curled his heat-radiating body directly over my torso, tucked his head under my chin, and forced his warmth into me. Good boy, I whispered, eyes fluttering. Just keep me awake, buddy. The water in the ravine was rising, a churning sluice of mud and debris. If we stayed, I'd drown in 20 minutes. If I moved, I'd bleed out. They will fail. My head slumped into the mud. The last thing I felt was Bandit's teeth gently gripping the heavy nylon drag handle on the back of my plate carrier. He was pulling. A 70-pound dog cannot drag a 200-pound man in waterlogged gear up a 30-degree incline. It defies physics. But adrenaline, relentless training, and a bond forged in blood and sweat make their own physics. Bandit lunged backward, hind legs driving into the earth like pistons. The mud, a deadly hazard a moment ago, became a lubricant. My body slid one agonizing foot up the embankment. He dug in again. Pull. Another foot. Pull. His paws began to bleed, the sharp rocks tearing his pads. He didn't stop. The violent jerking dragged me back from the edge of unconsciousness. I opened my eyes to total darkness, blinding rain, and the terrifying realization that I was moving backward up a cliff. Lightning flashed, lighting up Bandit's face inches from mine. Eyes wide, whites showing, jaws locked in a death grip on the strap, neck muscles straining against his collar. He was killing himself to save me. If I stayed dead weight, the exhaustion would take him. So I reached past the pain, past the cold, and found one flickering ember of will. I dug my elbows into the mud, planted my good left leg into the hillside. Pull, buddy. I rasped, timing my push to his lunges. Together we began a torturous, syncopated crawl. He'd be back. I'd push. 1 yard. 2. The storm washed the blood from us both. Every inch was a negotiation with agony, the fracture grating against itself, sending waves of nausea through me. I vomited bile into the mud and kept pushing. I couldn't let my dog fight alone. At the operations center, the room had gone dead silent. The general stood rigid before the topographical map. Might have been stationary for 30 minutes. Now, incredibly, it was moving. Sir, Chief Warrant Officer Briggs said, leaning into his terminal in disbelief. Telemetry's updating. Cole's tracker is moving out of the sector. The flash flood must have caught him, Hollister said, arms crossed. It's washing his body downstream. Negative, General. He's not moving down the ravine. He's moving up, gaining elevation. His pace is erratic but consistent. He's climbing a 40-degree grade, with a heart rate profile indicating massive trauma. That's impossible, Hollister snapped. He's delirious. He'll push himself right off a secondary drop. Then Master Chief Garrett stepped in, rain gear dripping. Op for Team 2 reported in. They heard a candidate screaming in the valley, but couldn't find him in the floodwaters. They did find shattered fiberglass antenna and a pool of arterial blood at a false ledge. If that's Cole, he's got a catastrophic lower leg injury. He should not be walking. Hollister stared at the blue dot inching up the contour lines. His data-driven worldview was colliding with something it couldn't explain. Get my vehicle, he ordered, voice dangerously low. Briggs, you're driving. Garrett, grab Corpsman Pace and a trauma kit. I want to see exactly what the hell is moving up that hill. The Humvee battered through the rain, tires spinning on degrading fire roads. Inside, the silence was thicker than the humidity. He's breached the top of the ridge, Hollister muttered at his GPS tablet. Heading toward Checkpoint Alpha. On the ridge, I had nothing left. My vision was black except for bursts of white light with every heartbeat. The tourniquet was holding, but the climb had drained the last of my cellular energy. I collapsed onto the flat, rocky plateau, convulsing in violent shivers. I was done. The fire in my chest had gone out. Bandit released the drag handle and collapsed beside me, chest heaving like a bellows, paws raw and bleeding. But even spent, he didn't rest. He crawled over me, positioned his chest directly over my heart, buried his nose in the crook of my neck, and fiercely guarded my fading warmth. Through the wind came a new sound, the deep growl of a diesel engine. Twin halogen beams cut through the rain, swept across the plateau, and settled on the two of us in the mud. The Humvee slammed to a halt, doors kicking open before it was even in park. Real world, no duff, move. Corpsman Pace screamed, leaping out with an orange trauma bag. Master Chief Garrett was right behind him with a flashlight, and General Hollister stepped out into the freezing rain, jaw set, preparing to shoot the dog. He knew the protocol. Injured handler, aggressive strangers approaching in the dark. The Malinois would view them as a threat and attack the medics. Exactly the liability he'd warned Sockham about. He unsnapped his holster as he walked up. Watch the K9, Garrett yelled over the storm, throwing up a hand to stop Pace. The corpsman froze 5 feet away. Bandit's head snapped up, ears pinned flat, teeth bared, a low rumble vibrating in his chest, audible even over the wind. He rose and planted his front paws squarely over my chest, turning himself into a living shield, his eyes reflecting the harsh halogen light like two burning coals. Hollister stepped forward, hand resting on his pistol grip. The dog's a threat. If he lunges, put him down. Beneath him, I drifted back to consciousness, pulled up by the lights and shouting. I felt the tension vibrating through Bandit's paws, the protective aggression rising in my partner, and I knew what would happen next if I didn't stop it. I forced my eyes open against the glare. I couldn't lift my head, but I could speak. With a voice barely a rasp, stripped of strength but laced with absolute authority, I whispered, "Bandit, house!" The command cut through his primal instinct like a scalpel. The growl ceased instantly. His ears flicked up. He looked down at me, then back at the medics. "Bandit, Plutz, down!" Shaking from exhaustion and cold, he stepped off me, took 2 steps to the right, laid down in the mud, and crossed his bleeding front paws. He never broke eye contact with Pace, but he yielded the ground, discipline triumphing over instinct. Pace rushed in, deployed a thermal blanket, checked the tourniquet. Tourniquet's holding, compound fracture of the right tibia. Pulse is weak. Stage 3 hypothermia. We need to evac him now. Hollister stood frozen in the rain, staring at the dog. Bandit was shivering violently now that he wasn't pressed against me, but he held his position perfectly, watching them slide in 4 into my arm, never moving a muscle, completely trusting my command. Slowly, the general let his hand fall away from his holster. He looked down at the muddy drag trail leading to the edge of the plateau, a deep groove carved into the earth, mixed with human and canine blood. And it hit him, heavy in the gut. I hadn't survived in spite of the dog. I'd survived because of him. "Get them both in the back," Hollister commanded, his voice suddenly thick. "Heat to maximum. Briggs, radio base. I want a surgical team standing by the second we cross the bridge." They loaded me onto a backboard. "Come on, pup," Garrett said softly, reaching for Bandit. Bandit ignored him, climbed up on his battered paws, limped to the Humvee, jumped into the back, and curled up tight against my uninjured side. As we tore down the mountain toward the hospital, the storm finally began to break, a faint gray dawn bleeding over the Pacific. 4 days later, General Mar Hollister walked into my recovery room at the Naval Medical Center, his cover under his arm. My right leg was heavily casted and elevated. I was pale and gaunt but clear-eyed. Lying right on the bed, head resting on my good knee, was Bandit, his paws wrapped in thick white bandages. "Attention on deck," I rasped, trying to push myself up. "As you were, petty officer." Hollister waved a hand and stood stiffly at the foot of the bed, looking at me, then at the Malinois. Bandit thumped his tail once against the mattress, keeping his chin on my leg. For a long moment, the general said nothing. A man who'd built his career on being right, on calculating odds and adjusting tactics. "I reviewed the telemetry, Cole," he finally said, quiet. "I saw the track. I saw the elevation you gained after the fracture. Just putting one foot in front of the other, sir." A faint wry smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Don't con me, son. You didn't walk up that incline. You couldn't have." He looked straight into Bandit's dark eyes. "I submitted my final report to SOCOM this morning on the canine integration assessment." I swallowed hard. "Did we fail the evolution, sir?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it gently on my tray table. I stated in my initial brief that an animal would be a catastrophic liability when the human element broke down. His posture straightened. "I was wrong. I've officially recommended immediate implementation of the program across all active teams. You prove the bond between a handler and his dog isn't a vulnerability. It's a force multiplier." He tapped the box. "That's a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. It's yours. But frankly, Cole, I think the dog earned the lion's share of it. Heal up. We need you both back in the teams." He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. I rested my hand on the warm, muscular neck of my partner. Bandit looked up, let out a soft, contented huff, and closed his eyes. We had survived Hell Week. We'd beaten the mountain, the storm, and the general's impossible odds. And we'd done it together. If this story of loyalty, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a Navy SEAL and his canine partner moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button to honor the bravery of military working dogs. Share it with your friends and family, and subscribe for more intense, real-life tactical stories and dramatic rescues. What did you think of Bandit's heroism? Drop a comment below.